The President, Cyril Ramaphosa, is about to deliver a keynote address at the first Nelson Mandela Youth Dialogue with young African leaders at the Walter Sisulu University Zamukulungisa campus in Mthatha in the Eastern Cape. Let's cross live to that.
Ministers here present also, and deputy ministers, the CEO of the NYDA, Mr. Wasim Karim, and of course the chairperson of the NYDA, Ms. Asanda Luaka, the Vice-Chancellor of Walter Sisulu University, Professor Songa, and the Secretary-General of the Pan-African Youth Union, Mr. Ahmed Benning, members of the board of the NYDA and representatives of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and representatives of the Nelson Mandela family, esteemed delegates and participants in this, the inaugural Nelson Mandela Youth Dialogue, and ladies and gentlemen. I'm really delighted to be here today and to have this opportunity to welcome you and also to participate in this dialogue. We gather here as we come from a number of countries on our continent and, of course, South Africa. We speak many languages as we are gathered here and come from very different places. I'm told that we have up to 18 countries represented here. As an inaugural dialogue, we ought to give that representation from 18 countries a round of applause. Much as we come from different places, we are all the children of one mother, Mother Africa. We are the roots of a single tree. We are also the tributaries of the many rivers that flow on our continent, rivers that flow into one sea. All of us are a piece of this continent. As Africans, we are united in our diversity, and our unity is our greatest strength. And as we are gathered here today, under one roof as one family in honor of the memory of one of the outstanding sons of our continent, Nelson Mandela, who, as we've heard, we honor with our presence here in a place where he was born and grew up. The conceptualization of this youth dialogue was inspired by Nelson Mandela's cherished dream to see the young people of our continent, Africa, come together to unite, but also to collaborate to solve our many challenges. You could say that our being here as well at this dialogue is also inspired by the struggles and the work and the lives and the dreams of other giants of our continent, all of whom have already departed from this life. Giants like Kwame Nkrumah, Murtala Mohammed of Nigeria, Patrice Lumumba of Congo, Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, Agostinho Neto of Angola, Eduardo Mondlane of Mozambique, Seretse Khama of Botswana, and our own Albert Luthuli, Oliver Reginald Tambo, and many others. The idea of bringing the youth of the continent in the manner that we have now done together to start the important conversations about leadership, about development and political change, first came to me during a visit that I had to the Republic of Senegal in December 2021. After delivering a lecture at the Sheikh Anta Diop University, the students that I had had a wide-ranging discussion on various topics. And these included the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, but they went beyond that. They also, Professor Songa included the role of African universities in the development of our continent and also in the production of knowledge. The discussions also revolved around economic integration, sustainable development, constitutionalism, human rights, fundamental freedoms, creativity, innovation, and economic development broadly. It struck me then, as I was having these discussions with students, as it has always, whenever I travel in other parts of our continent, just how many opportunities there are for Africa's young people to collaborate. There is so much that young people across the continent can learn from each other, can learn from each other's experiences. They can draw on each other's strengths, capabilities, and in many ways encourage each other as they take up the mantle of leadership. What I have always found deeply moving is the great regard in which Nelson Mandela is held across the African continent. There are streets named after him. There are buildings also named after him. At the AU headquarters, there's a big hall that is named after him as well. There are images of him littered across the continent, and there are continuous lectures held in his name and honor, and there are also talks about him and his memory. It is nearly always the first name that enters conversation whenever any one of us who are South Africans travel across the world, as they know that we are from Nelson Mandela's country. The students of Sheikh Anta Diop University were eager to talk to me about Nelson Mandela's legacy. So when the idea of convening this dialogue for African youth first took place, I knew that it had to be aligned with President Mandela and his legacy, his leadership, and his Pan-African outlook as well. It was fortunate that just days after returning from my state visit to Senegal, that I met with the newly appointed board of the National Youth Development Agency and presented my idea and my vision for the holding of this youth dialogue. I envisaged a situation where we would once a year take this dialogue not only in South Africa, but also take it to other countries and bring together the youth of the continent to come and talk about their development. So having originated here, I envisage that the next one will be in another country. And yes, it will have been originated in South Africa, but it is the type of dialogue that should bring young people together, that should be embraced and owned, yes, broadly by various countries and by our continent as well. I'm grateful for the commitment of the NYDA, Chairperson Asanda Luaka, and indeed all of you in the NYDA, but I'm also very pleased with the commitment of the Nelson Mandela Foundation and also for the Nelson Mandela family, that South Africa, yes, convenes this very first one, particularly on the topic of ethical leadership. That day has now finally come. In this room today are young people from North, East, West, Central, and Southern Africa, as well as from the diaspora as well. You are here as youth leaders from your respective countries who want to be part of the solution to Africa's many challenges. You are here because, as young people, you demand, as it was clearly stated by Deputy Chairperson Mohale, when she said you demand to be part of decision-making and shaping a future that is essentially yours. We see the Nelson Mandela Youth Dialogue as a collective that brings together the builders of a new Africa. As young people, you are indeed the next generation. You are the innovators, the change makers, and the agents of progress that all of us are looking forward to take this beautiful continent of ours forward. It was Nelson Mandela who offered the finest description of this concept. And he said, sometimes it falls upon a generation, as Premier Mabuyane said, to be great. You can be that generation. Let your greatness blossom. He called young people the rock on which our future will be built. He called them our greatest asset as a nation and indeed as a continent. He said, you will be the leaders of our country, the creators of our national wealth, and those who care for and protect our people. He saw young people as the builders of a better Africa and indeed a better world. We are therefore delighted that we can take a critical step towards fulfilling his vision with the launch of this inaugural Nelson Mandela Youth Dialogue. As we gather here, we dare declare that essentially our identity is unambiguously African. That is something that we should never forget. As Nelson Mandela and all the other leaders I referred to never forgot. We dare say that our being is one with Africa, that we are loyal disciples and advocates for Africa's development. We must insist that we are unmistakably products of Africa's long and complex, rich history. We maintain, too, that we are ultimately the authors of Africa's inevitable great future. You are the authors. Through your lives, you are writing Africa's great future that beckons. We are Africans, as Kwame Nkrumah told us, not because we were born in Africa, but because Africa was born in us. To realize Africa's ability to give birth to a world with a more human face, we carry the responsibility to confront the colonial limitations that were imposed upon us. Through brute force, humiliation, through the plunder of our resources, through the enslavement of minds and bodies, our people on the African continent were stripped of their humanity and dignity. For the cruel and brutal, exploitative and absurd colonial project to prosper, we were reduced to and regarded as unimaginative, primitive savages who were regarded as merely content with subsistence living. our way of life, our history, our cultures, our belief systems, our customs, our traditions, and our economic life were denigrated. They were even frowned upon. They were ridiculed and ultimately destroyed. Long after the overthrow of colonial rule, imperialism and racial prejudice prevented our historical wounds from properly healing and for us to freely march towards progress. As it was said by Frantz Fanon, who said, "Imperialism leaves behind germs of rot, which we must clinically detect and remove from our land, but from our minds as well." That imperialism flourished because it made the oppressed people of our continent believe some of the worst lies about themselves. To be black and African carried a burdensome weight, irrespective of one's standing in African society. Our kings and queens and leaders of old were reduced to what they called non-entities. So this dialogue should be about affirming who we are as a people. It should be about affirming our individual and collective self-worth as a people, and our determination to develop our continent, Africa, through innovative entrepreneurship. It should also be about giving space and opportunity to the entrepreneurial spirit, talents, and energy of Africa's youth to take their rightful place in the regeneration of the economic fortunes of our continent. But also, it is the time when ethical leadership should come to the fore to lead this continent forward. It should be about raising our consciousness to the endless possibility that the idea and experience of being African carries. It should be about us taking advantage of the vast golden opportunities available in the program of rebuilding our continent. A more humane and just world cannot blossom without an African renaissance, without embracing African values, values of ethical leadership, good governance systems and processes, and without an appreciation of African aspirations. The foundations for this are already being laid. We see examples of dynamism and vision of youth throughout our continent. With the support of the African Development Bank, for instance, young urban farmers in Nigeria, in Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo are running businesses focused on climate-smart agriculture and are using new technologies for sustainable food production. Similar projects to support food security by bringing young people into agriculture are underway in Zambia through the YAPASA program, in South Africa through the Presidential Employment Program, Stimulus Program, and in other countries. In Kenya's capital, Nairobi, young men are leading the groundbreaking No Means No projects to educate men and boys about sexual consent. According to data from the project, sexual violence has dramatically reduced in settlements where their classes are taking place. Across Africa, young people are becoming entrepreneurs. in areas such as waste recycling, mobile money, aquaculture, IT, and e-learning. Yes, a number of them are becoming manufacturers and industrialists. Many of these businesses are in direct response to the needs and circumstances of the communities in which they operate. In Nigeria, for instance, a young entrepreneur has started a ride-hailing and diversity delivery service for motorcycle taxis, also known as Okadas and Pikipikis. Young African climate activists like Vanessa Nakate from Uganda have been raising awareness and speaking for climate justice for many years, far away from the news cameras. In the troubled Eastern DRC, which is bearing the brunt of violence and conflict, young people in Ituri province are coming together and meeting with government leaders and civil society groups around peace issues and governance issues and the role that they can play in peace building. When it comes to agitating for political change and human rights, it has been Africa's youth that has been giving a voice to the disaffected and marginalized through music, popular culture, art, cinema, and protest. All of these examples make a strong case that the solutions to Africa's problems are well within our grasp. Many of them are already being implemented in Africa, for Africa, and by young Africans. This proves that we no longer need to look outside of our continent to find solutions to Africa's problems. And that is why the AU's slogan is African Solutions for African Problems. The Nelson Mandela Dialogue is an engagement between young Africans on the most critical and pressing issues of our time, such as youth unemployment, African trade and economic integration, entrepreneurship, sustainable development, climate change, and good governance. This dialogue is just the start. We want to start a conversation about ethical leadership, drawing on the Mandela legacy. And in doing so, we want to light a spark and a fuse in the minds of young people from across our continent who aspire to lead. Africa does not need leaders who just want to lead. It needs leaders who are ethical and principled. It needs leaders of courage, leaders with an unwavering commitment to advancing human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, regardless of race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, political orientation, or whether one is born rich or poor, and whether one is born in one region, rural or urban or not. Africa's diversity must be a source of our strength, not a cause for division. True leaders stand up for truth and justice. They stand up against inhumanity in all its forms and manifestations, and always strive for peace as a precondition for progress. We need leaders who understand that to lead the people, you must first be amongst the people, and to respond to their most immediate and pressing needs. We recall the example of the great Thomas Sankara, who, after leading a revolution in his country, set about mobilizing the people of Burkina Faso especially young people, to build schools, to build clinics, dams and irrigation systems. In the early days of the Cuban Revolution, which greatly inspired post-independence movements in Africa, young people were sent into the towns and villages to teach people to read and act that transformed that country. Yes, we do need leaders who are infused with love for their country and for their continent, who do not tailor their patriotism to whether they are speaking to audiences at home or abroad. We cannot raise Africa high in the world if our own leaders take nothing but stories of gloom to foreign capitals. I recall President Mandela's words, which are narrated in the book Conversations with Myself, where he says, "Even the younger generation of today still values the experience of elders, young men and women who are grappling every day with fresh, practical, human problems, like to test the knowledge acquired from the classroom and books against the experience of their mature seniors who have been in the field." President Mandela was often asked what influenced his worldview, and he said, he spoke about his own upbringing here in this area, his interactions as a young man with leaders in his community here in this area, meeting other political and world leaders and ordinary men and women and children throughout the world that he had met during the course of his life. He was a great leader who embodied all the qualities I've just described. We see the Nelson Mandela Youth Dialogue as an incubator of the next generation of African leaders. That is why I'm proud to announce the establishment of a fellowship program for extraordinary young leaders. This fellowship will enable people to pursue a year-long fellowship in South Africa and be trained on a curriculum of leadership, governance, economics, and development. We plan to have our first intake in 2024 academic year. Now, Africa is a continent on the ascent. Democracy is being consolidated. It is being broadened and deepened, despite a few isolated examples of regression. Several African economies are growing and thriving, and this will only improve once the African Continental Free Trade Area becomes fully operational. With its vast natural resources, Africa is poised to take advantage of the global shift towards low-carbon, climate-resilient development, an issue that you will be discussing in the next day and two. Across Africa, there is bountiful wind and solar power, geothermal energy and biofuels. Across Africa, there are natural gifts that can secure not only our energy future, but the future of our manufacturing base, and also be able to meet the needs of people on our continent. As the continent, we must be committed to the transition to just energy, but also to a future where real outstanding products are manufactured on our continent. Where, as Minister Dlamini Zuma said, we are no longer exporting rock and soil, where we are exporting finished products of a world-class nature so that the world can truly see what Africa is all about and the capability of Africans. Africa's human capital is its greatest asset. Our people, especially young people, are creating their own opportunities as entrepreneurs by working the land, by applying innovative solutions to age-old problems. This is not to make light of the many challenges we still face, challenges of poverty, unemployment, inequality, conflict, disease, gender-based violence, and the gaping wound of inequality between and within nations in our continent. Yet we look to the future with optimism. It is up to young people brimming with talent, with energy, with vitality, and hope to fulfill the promise of the generations that came before. Development depends on good governance, but it also depends on strong leadership. This is what will unlock Africa's potential. History bears witness to the value of investing in the development of leaders. The Nelson Mandela Youth Dialogue and the Fellowship seeks to be part of this endeavor. Africa's future in the end, as young people, is in your hands. It is a great responsibility and a duty, but also a doable one. You will encounter many setbacks. At times, you may doubt yourself and your course of action. It will take time and it will take immense sacrifice and effort. But you will not give in or give up. You will be fortified by experience, by learning from each other, and by also knowing that, yes, you stand on the shoulders of giants who have come before you. And that is the purpose of this initiative. Change will come from the decisions that you as young people make, the actions that you undertake, from the values by which you choose to live. We have one political freedom in Africa. It is your responsibility to pursue economic freedom, prosperity, and unity. In 1961, at the height of apartheid, Nelson Mandela released a statement from the underground explaining his decision to not leave South Africa but to continue with his political work. He asked his countrymen and women, "What are you going to do? Will you come along with us, or are you going to remain silent and neutral in a matter of life and death to my people, to your people?" For my own part, he continued, "I have made my choice. Only through hardship, sacrifice, and militant action can freedom be won." And he ended by saying, "The struggle is my life." As earlier said, because of the strong foundation that has been laid for you as young people in the modern era, you are able to go by the experience of those who have come before you, but you are also able to capitalize on the great progress that has been made so far. As Africa's next leaders, you will bring us the peace and collective prosperity we seek as a continent. Let it be that this cause, this struggle, too, becomes your life, your preoccupation, and your foremost goal. Become the next generation of principled, ethical, servant leaders that usher in a new era of African progress. Be assured that in doing so, you have the support and the full support of this Nelson Mandela Dialogue and Fellowship. This dialogue is essentially about the role of enterprise in bringing a better life to all our people on the continent. To succeed, we must affirm Africa as a birthplace of all humanity and cradle for civilization, for disciplines or knowledge systems such as archaeology, history, science, which confirms Africa as a preeminent center of innovation, scholarship, and commerce. John Reader, in his book called Africa, a biography of the continent, affirms Africa's pivotal role in creativity and innovation and civilization when he attests that about 100,000 years ago, groups of modern humans left Africa for the first time and progressively colonized the rest of the world. And he continues, he says, the innovative talent that these humans who left our continent, that innovative talent they had developed in Africa, carried them into every exploitable niche of the world. They took that innovative talent with them because it had been developed on the African soil. They moved across the Sinai Peninsula and were living in the Eastern Mediterranean region by 90,000 years ago. They had reached Asia, he says, and Australia by 40,000 years ago, and Europe by 30,000 years ago. They had crossed the Bering Straits by 15,000 years ago and had reached the southern tip of South America 12,000 years ago. The last remaining large habitable landmass, New Zealand, was colonized 700 years ago. By the early 1990s, people had been to the moon. And he says such achievements all had happened by virtue of the talent which had evolved in Africa. And says, given this account, one can say that if modern civilization and technological development that we see around us today are judged to be the epitome of human achievement, then it is unlikely that the material way of life which most of humanity currently aspires would have happened without the innovative talent that originated on the African continent. In order to drive the development of our continent, to free ourselves from economic injustice, the social marginalization, Africa's youth must know that innovative talent originated in Africa, and they share an affinity with the civilizations of Egypt, Timbuktu, Mapungubwe, and the great Zimbabwe. In our quest to root out the scourge of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, in our pursuit for an equitable economic renaissance, we must simultaneously plant the seeds of Africa's regeneration. We must purposely celebrate Black excellence and innovation to demonstrate that over a millennia we possessed and refashioned a culture of energy, innovation, vigor, and strength. Just for your remembrance, today marks 3 years since the WHO, the World Health Organization, first characterized COVID-19 as a pandemic. In that time, we have seen extraordinary feats of scientific innovation and enormous social mobilization of resources. Unfortunately, we also saw a global response held back by profiteering and nationalism. Africa during this period distinguished itself as a creative continent, we were able to navigate our way around COVID, and were able to demonstrate our own excellence in the way that we were able to identify the various variants of the virus, which surprised the world. We were also able to advocate for the manufacturing of vaccines. More than any other continent, we were at the forefront of doing so. We did so because we wanted to demonstrate our own innovativeness, our own creativity, and to show the world that much as in the past, in the days of colonialism, we were seen as being, or called backwards, that Africa indeed is the home of innovation, is the home of creativity, is the home of great energy. And today, I call upon young people, you all as young people who are the future of our continent, to live up to that creativity, that innovation, so that you can demonstrate to all and sundry that your forebears are those who inspire you, even forebears from 100,000 years ago, because Africa, being the cradle of humanity, is also the cradle of innovation, creativity, and all that is good and best that lies ahead, that is now in your hands to take this great continent forward. I thank you.